A forgotten beginning. What America was before Columbus. Imagine discovering that an entire world existed, and almost no one remembers it. Not a small village, not a forgotten tribe, but tens of millions of people, living, farming, building cities, speaking thousands of languages across an entire hemisphere. A world so vast and diverse that it stretched from the frozen shores of Alaska to the steaming forests of the Amazon, from the endless plains of North America to the towering spine of the Andes. And yet, when most of us learned history, the story seemed to begin in a single year. 1492. Christopher Columbus arrives. The New World is discovered, and the rest supposedly begins. But the more I started digging into this history, the more unsettling the question became. What if America wasn't new at all? What if, long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, this land was already home to civilizations older than many of the nations we know today? Civilizations built by people who had crossed into this continent tens of thousands of years ago during the Ice Age, walking across a vast land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. From that frozen gateway, generation after generation moved southward, spreading across mountains, forests, deserts, and rivers. Over thousands of years, they formed thousands of nations, each with its own language, traditions, and understanding of the world. Scientists today estimate that before Europeans arrived, the population of the Americas may have reached somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, nearly 10% of the entire human population at the time. Let that sink in. A continent full of life, culture, and knowledge, long before the word America even existed. Hello everyone, and welcome to Echoes of Ancient Greece. On this channel we explore the forgotten corners of history, the stories that were overshadowed, simplified, or sometimes completely erased. If you enjoy discovering the deeper layers of the past, consider subscribing and supporting the channel so we can continue uncovering these remarkable stories together. Because the deeper I look into the history of the first peoples of the Americas, the more I realize something extraordinary. The story we were told may only be the beginning of a much older one. A continent of civilizations, the cultures of the first peoples. And once you begin to look past the simple labels history gave these people, something remarkable starts to appear. A world not of one culture, but of countless civilizations shaped by the lands they called home. What strikes me most is how deeply each society seemed to understand its environment. In the forests and fertile valleys of what is now the southeastern United States, the Cherokee people practiced a form of agriculture that feels surprisingly modern even today. They cultivated what is often called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. At first it sounds like a simple combination of crops, but it was actually a carefully balanced system. Corn grew tall and strong, acting as a natural pole for bean vines to climb. Beans enriched the soil with nitrogen, feeding the other plants, and squash spread low across the ground, its wide leaves locking in moisture and protecting the soil. It was farming designed not to overpower nature, but to cooperate with it. Further south, in Central America, another society had taken a completely different path, one that led to some of the most impressive cities in the world at the time. The Aztec built their capital on an island in a vast lake, connected by causeways and canals that turned the city into a kind of floating metropolis. By the 15th century, it may have held around 200,000 people, making it larger than many European cities of the same era. Markets bustled with trade, temples rose high above the city, and enormous pyramids served as sacred spaces where rituals honored the gods they believed controlled the sun, rain, and the rhythm of life itself. And then there were the people of the Andes, the builders of the Inca world. High in the mountains, where steep slopes and thin air would seem to make agriculture impossible, they engineered terraces carved directly into the mountainsides. These stone steps transformed harsh landscapes into fertile farmland where potatoes and corn could grow, feeding millions. Without a traditional written language, they used quipu, bundles of knotted cords, to record taxes, populations, and the movement of goods across their empire. But what fascinates me most is their sense of community. Through a system known as Aini, people worked together on shared land and supported one another as if the entire society were one extended family. The more I imagine this world, the harder it becomes to see it as primitive or simple. It was something far richer. A continent filled with knowledge, creativity, and cultures that had learned, in their own ways, how to live with the land rather than simply conquer it. When worlds collided, Columbus and the turning point of history, and yet, as rich and complex as this world was, it stood on the edge of a turning point that almost no one living there could possibly have imagined. In October of 1492, a fleet of wooden ships crossed the Atlantic carrying a man who believed he had found a new route to Asia. When Christopher Columbus stepped onto an island in the Bahamas, he thought he had reached the eastern edge of India. Because of that mistake, he called the people he encountered Indios. From that moment on, the name Indians entered European languages, a label that would follow the native peoples of the Americas for centuries, even though it had nothing to do with who they really were. But the ships that arrived in the New World carried far more than explorers and new names. They carried ambition. European powers were searching for gold, silver, land, and the opportunity to spread their religion. Spain, England, France, and Portugal would soon follow, each seeking to claim pieces of this vast continent. Yet the most devastating force they brought was not their weapons or their flags. It was something invisible. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles traveled silently across the Americas, spreading from community to community long before many people had even seen a European face. For the native populations, these illnesses were completely unknown. Their bodies had no natural immunity to them, and the results were catastrophic. When I first encountered the numbers historians estimate, I had to pause for a moment just to grasp their scale. In parts of Mexico, populations that may have once reached 25 million people fell to around 1 million by the early 1600s. Across the Americas as a whole, scholars believe that between 80 and 90% of the indigenous population may have died during the 16th and 17th centuries. It's difficult to comprehend a loss on that scale. Entire villages disappeared. Knowledge passed. Down for generations vanished with the people who carried it. Fields were left untended, cities fell silent, and countless stories simply faded out of human memory. When we talk about great disasters in human history, we often think of wars or single dramatic events. But this was something different, slower, quieter, and in many ways even more devastating. A continent that had once held tens of millions of people was suddenly transformed in ways no one living at the time could fully understand. Conquest, displacement, and the struggle to survive, and as devastating as those waves of disease were, they were only the beginning of a much longer struggle that would reshape the fate of entire civilizations. In Central America, the collision between worlds soon turned into open conquest. In 1521, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés marched toward the powerful Aztec capital with only a few hundred soldiers. On paper, it seems almost impossible, an empire confronted by a force so small. But Cortés understood something crucial. The Aztec were not the only people in the region. Many neighboring tribes had long resented Aztec rule, and the Spanish used that tension to their advantage, forming alliances that tipped the balance of power. Combined with steel weapons, firearms, and the continuing spread of disease, the Aztec empire eventually collapsed, bringing an end to one of the most remarkable urban civilizations in the Americas. A little more than a decade later, something similar unfolded in South America. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers encountered the vast Inca Empire in the Andes. The Inca world had once supported millions of people across mountains and valleys, but internal conflict and epidemics had already weakened the empire. Pizarro captured the Inca ruler during a dramatic encounter, and what followed was the gradual dismantling of a civilization that had taken centuries to build. Lands were seized, temples were destroyed or repurposed, and countless people were forced into labor in silver mines and colonial systems that served distant empires. Meanwhile, further north in what would become the United States, a different but equally painful transformation was taking place. Early encounters between indigenous communities and European settlers sometimes began with cooperation. There are accounts of native groups sharing food, knowledge of local plants, and even medical remedies with newcomers struggling to survive in unfamiliar environments. But as colonial settlements expanded, The pressure on land grew stronger. Farms spread, forests were cleared, and conflicts over territory became increasingly common. Over time, many native nations were pushed from their ancestral homelands. One of the most heartbreaking chapters came in 1830, when the United States government passed the Indian Removal Act. Tens of thousands of indigenous people, men, women, and children, were forced to leave the lands east of the Mississippi River and march hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territory in present-day Oklahoma. The journey, later known as the Trail of Tears, stretched for more than 1,000 miles, through harsh weather, hunger, and disease. Thousands did not survive the journey, and even after the physical battle subsided, another kind of struggle continued, one aimed not at conquering land, but at erasing culture itself. They never disappeared. The resilience and revival of indigenous nations. Yet even when land was taken and traditions were pushed to the margins, the story of the first peoples of the Americas did not end there. By the beginning of the 20th century, the situation looked almost hopeless. After centuries of disease, conflict, displacement, and forced assimilation, the indigenous population in the United States had fallen to roughly 250,000 people by the year 1900. When I first read that number, I couldn't help but think about how dramatic that decline truly was. From tens of millions across the continent to only a fraction of that in just a few centuries, it felt as though entire worlds had nearly vanished. But history has a way of surprising us. Over the course of the 20th century, something remarkable began to happen. Indigenous communities slowly started to recover, both in population and in cultural confidence. Families preserved languages that had once been discouraged or even forbidden. Traditions that had been forced underground began to reappear in ceremonies, schools, and community gatherings. By 2010, the Native American population in the United States had grown to around 2.9 million people. If you include individuals with partial indigenous ancestry, that number rises to about 5.2 million by 2020. Today, the United States officially recognizes 574 federally recognized tribes, each with its own identity, leadership, and cultural traditions. Nations such as the Navajo, now numbering roughly 400,000 people, continue to live across some of the largest reservations in the country. The story of resilience stretches far beyond the United States as well. In many parts of Latin America, indigenous communities form a significant part of the population. In Bolivia, for example, around 62% of the people identify as indigenous. In Guatemala, the figure is about 41%, and in Peru, roughly a quarter of the population traces its roots to indigenous ancestry. Across the Andes and into the Amazon, communities still speak native languages, weave traditional textiles, cultivate ancient crops like potatoes and corn, and maintain spiritual traditions that have endured for centuries. One moment that symbolizes this renewed voice occurred in 2005 when Evo Morales, himself of indigenous Aymara heritage, became the first indigenous president of Bolivia. His leadership pushed forward constitutional reforms recognizing dozens of indigenous languages and strengthening protections for ancestral lands. Today, historians estimate that roughly 70 million indigenous people live across the Americas. When I think about that number, it reminds me of something powerful. Despite everything that happened, epidemics, displacement, and cultural suppression, these nations were never completely erased. Their story did not end. It simply continued, often quietly, waiting for the world to listen again.